The rain didn't fall in Seoul anymore. It descended as a heavy, acidic mist that clung to the neon signs and turned the city into a blurred kaleidoscope of blue and pink. On the edge of the Lotte skyrise, 60 stories above the enforced silence of the streets, the only sound was the frantic rhythm of my own heart. It was a traitorous sound, too fast, too loud, the kind of biometric deviance that got people erased. "Don't move," a voice commanded. It wasn't loud, but it had the weight of a falling guillotine. I froze, the stolen data drive digging into the palm of my hand. I turned slowly, my boots skidding on the slick duracrete. Standing there was June. He looked less like a man and more like a statue carved from obsidian. His black overcoat snapped in the wind, and his eyes, dark, piercing, and devoid of the mercy the world had outlawed 20 years ago, were locked onto mine. He raised his weapon. The suppressor glinted under the flickering light of a nearby billboard. "You were fast, Arya," he said, his voice a smooth, dangerous, melodic hum. "But no one outruns the syndicate. Give me the drive and I'll make the transition quick. No pain, no memory." "Is that what you tell yourself to sleep at night?" I breathed, my voice trembling despite the fire in my chest. I stepped back, my heel hovering over the empty abyss. "That you're being merciful by turning people into ghosts?" June took a step forward, his finger tightening on the trigger. In this world, any surge of adrenaline or spike in oxytocin was flagged by the city's censors as an emotional contagion. We were supposed to be flatlines. We were supposed to be machines. But as he closed the distance, I saw it, the slight, almost imperceptible tremor in his hand. "You're a liability," he hissed, but he was licking at my eyes, not the drive. "Then pull the trigger, June. Do your duty. Kill the girl who made you feel something other than cold." The silence stretched, agonizing and thick. The city's scanners swept over us, a red laser grid searching for a heartbeat that didn't belong. If he didn't fire now, the automated turrets would mark us both. June's gaze broke, the ice in his expression shattered, replaced by a raw, terrifying confusion. He didn't fire. Instead, he lunged forward, grabbing my jacket and yanking me away from the ledge. He slammed me against the cold brick of the stairwell, his body shielding mine from the overhead scanners. The gun was still in his hand, but it was pressed against his own side now. His breath was ragged, warm against my skin, a forbidden heat. "You're going to be the death of me," he whispered, his eyes searching mine with a desperation that mirrored my own. In a world where love was a death sentence, he had just signed his own execution warrant. He hadn't killed me. He had chosen me. And as the sirens began to wail in the distance, I realized that I wasn't just a thief anymore. I was his weakness. The descent into the syndicate's subterranean headquarters felt like entering the throat of a great, metallic beast. The elevator moved in a pressurized hiss, plunging us deep beneath the city's glowing crust. June stood inches from me, his presence a suffocating weight of expensive cologne and cold gunpowder. He hadn't spoken since the rooftop, his jaw set in a line so rigid it looked like it might snap. When the door slid open, the air changed. It became recycled, sterile, and heavy with the scent of ozone. This was the hive. Dozens of men in sharp tactical suits moved with robotic precision, their eyes fixed on tablets that monitored the city's pulse. To them, I wasn't a person. I was a malfunction to be corrected. "Status report," a high-ranking lieutenant barked, stepping towards us. His eyes flicked to the heavy iron cuffs June had snapped onto my wrists. A necessary theatre. The thief was intercepted, June replied, his voice regaining that terrifying flat resonance. He didn't look at me. She's a high-level courier for the resistance. I'm keeping her in the sub-level cells for interrogation. No one enters without my biometric clearance. Not even you, Kale. Kale lingered, his gaze sliding over my features with a clinical suspicion. She looks like a waste of resources, boss. Why not just extract the data and recycle her? Because she knows the encryption keys, June lied, the falsehood rolling off his tongue with practiced ease. And I don't like leaving loose ends. He gripped my arm, his fingers digging into my skin with more force than necessary, a warning to stay silent. He dragged me through the labyrinth of glass-walled corridors until we reached a private sector, shielded from the main surveillance grid. The cell wasn't a cage of bars, but a room of reinforced glass and white light. As the door sealed with a vacuum click, June finally let go. He turned his back to me, bracing his hands against a console. His shoulders were heaving. "You can't keep me here," I whispered, the sound echoing in the sterile space. "Your people, they're collectors of anomalies. They'll see through this." June turned around, his eyes dark with a mixture of fury and something far more dangerous. He stepped into my personal space, forcing me back against the glass. He reached out, his thumb tracing the line of my jaw with a touch so light it was almost a ghost of a sensation. "Then we play the game," he murmured, his face inches from mine. "You are my asset, my prisoner, my tool. As long as they believe I'm breaking you, they won't look at how you're breaking me." It was a dangerous dance. In this room, we were predator and prey. But as his gaze dropped to my lips, the lie felt thinner than the glass separating us from the world. The morning light in the hive was artificial, a cold spectrum designed to keep the human mind in a state of perpetual, emotionless focus. I sat on the edge of the cot in my glass cage, watching the digital clock on the wall bleed seconds. Every hour, a soft hum vibrated through the floor, the sound of the city's central nervous system conducting a remote biometric sweep of every living soul in the sector. June entered the interrogation suite with his usual predatory grace, a file tucked under his arm. To the cameras, he looked like a man about to break a dissident. But as the door hissed shut, his pace faltered. He didn't look at the file, he looked at me, and I felt the air in the room thicken. "Sit," he commanded, though the edge in his voice lacked its usual bite. He took his seat across from me at the metal table. Suddenly, the wall-mounted monitor, a direct feed to the syndicate's medical oversight, flickered to life. A jagged line of neon green began to pulse across the screen, accompanied by a rhythmic, low-frequency chime. It was June's heart rate. At first, it was steady, 60 beats per minute, a perfect icy baseline. "The council is asking for the encryption keys, Aria," he said, leaning in. His eyes searched mine, and for a second, the mask slipped. He wasn't thinking about keys. He was looking at the way my hair fell over my shoulder, the way my breath hitched when he moved closer. The chime on the wall sped up. 70, 85. "June," I whispered, a warning and a plea. "The monitor." He didn't pull away. If anything, he leaned closer, his hand resting on the table inches from mine. The proximity was electric, a violation of every law we had been raised to obey. My own pulse was a hammer in my ears, and I knew the sensors were picking up the heat radiating between us. 95, 100. A sharp crimson light began to flash at the corner of the screen. A mechanical voice echoed through the room. "Warning, subject 001. Physiological spike detected. Biometric deviation exceeding safety parameters. Please self-regulate." June's jaw tightened. He knew the data was being logged in real time at the Central Bureau. They would see this, a cold leader's heart racing like a panicked animal just by sitting across from a prisoner. It was the digital fingerprint of a forbidden emotion. It's the adrenaline of the interrogation. June snapped toward the ceiling, his voice echoing for the benefit of the hidden microphones. But as he looked back at me, his hand finally crossed the distance, his fingers brushing against my wrist where the cuffs bit into the skin. The monitor let out a long, high-pitched whine as his heart rate spiked to a dangerous 120. "You're going to get yourself killed," I breathed, my eyes darting to the flashing red warning. "Let them watch," he muttered, his voice thick with a defiance I had never heard. "Let them see what a heart looks like when it finally wakes up." The door at the end of the hall chimed, a notification that a manual override was being initiated. The oversight was coming to see the traitor for themselves. The manual override chime was still echoing in the hallway when June lunged for the wall, his fingers flying across a hidden keypad. With a sharp hiss of static, the heavy industrial fans groaned to life, flooding the room with a dull white noise roar that masked our voices from the microphones. He killed the lights, plunging the interrogation suite into a world of deep shadows and flickering blue emergency pulses. "We have 2 minutes before they force the door," he rasped, his shadow looming over me. The cold, calculated leader was gone, replaced by a man standing on the edge of a precipice. "Why are you doing this?" I asked, my voice barely a thread in the dark. "You're throwing away an empire for a ghost." "I'm tired of being a statue, Arya." He sat on the floor beside my cot, away from the camera's primary angle. The vulnerability in his posture was more shocking than any violence. "Tell me something real, before they come in and turn the world grey again. Tell me why you're really running." I hesitated, the weight of a dozen secrets pressing against my ribs. Then, I reached for the high collar of my tactical jacket. My fingers trembled as I unzipped the reinforced fabric, pulling it back to reveal the jagged silver line of a scar that ran from the hollow of my throat down toward my collarbone. It wasn't a clean wound, it was the mark of a correction, the botched surgical attempt to remove the emotional centers of my brain when I was a child. "I'm an anomaly," I whispered. "They tried to fix me, to make me like them, but the machine failed." I woke up on the table feeling everything. The cold, the fear, the hate. I've spent my whole life hiding the fact that I'm not empty. June reached out, his hand hovering in the dark, before his fingers finally made contact with the ridge of the scar. His touch wasn't clinical. It was reverent. I expected him to pull away in disgust at my brokenness, but instead, he leaned his forehead against mine. The heat of him was the only thing that felt certain in a world built on lies. "They call it a defect," he murmured, his breath ghosting over my lips. "But it's the only beautiful thing I've seen in years." The red light on the door turned amber. The lock was being cycled. "They're coming," I said, my heart drumming a frantic rhythm against his chest. June stood up, his face hardening back into the mask of the Mafia king as the shadows retreated. But he didn't pull his hand away until the very last second. "Let them come," he said, his voice a low, lethal promise. "They think they're hunting a thief. They have no idea they've already lost their leader." The grand hall of the syndicate's spire was a cathedral of glass and gold, filled with the elite of a world that had forgotten how to laugh. The air was thick with the scent of expensive champagne and the chilling absence of music. Here, socializing was a tactical exercise. Everyone wore masks, porcelain, minimalist designs that hid facial micro-expressions from the high-resolution cameras patrolling the ceiling. June looked every bit the tyrant. He wore a tailored black suit that seemed to absorb the light, his hand gripped firmly around my upper arm. I had been forced into a dress of midnight silk,
a trophy draped in chains of fine silver that looked like jewelry but felt like a leash. To the onlookers, I was his conquered prize, a broken rebel brought to heel. "Keep your head down." June leaned in, his voice a cold blade against my ear for the benefit of the council members watching from the balconies. "Look like you hate me. It's the only way they'll believe you're still under my thumb." "That part won't be hard," I bit back, though my pulse betrayed me, leaping at the feel of his chest against my back as he led me onto the floor. The dance was a required ritual, a display of coordination and control. As the mechanical hum of the ambient synth track began, June pulled me into the frame of a waltz. It was a dance of shadows. His hand on my waist was firm, steering me with a dominance that looked cruel to any observer. But beneath the heavy silk of his glove, I felt his fingers tap a rhythmic code against my hip. "Trust me." We spun through the sea of emotionless masks. My eyes were locked onto his, searching for the man who had touched my scar in the dark. Outwardly, his expression was a mask of bored contempt. But as he dipped me low, his face inches from mine, the mask of the Mafia king cracked just enough for me to see the fire burning in the depths of his pupils. "Kyle is watching from the north pillar," June whispered, his lips barely moving. "His scanner is calibrated for pupil dilation. Look away, Arya." "Look at me with disgust." I did as he asked, sneering as I pulled back, playing the part of the defiant captive. But as he spun me back into his arms, our bodies collided with a force that made the world outside our circle vanish. For a heartbeat, the gala, the masks, and the death sentences didn't matter. There was only the heat of his palm and the silent scream of everything we couldn't say. The dance ended with a sharp, synchronized halt. June released me with a practiced shove, his face returning to its icy, impenetrable baseline. "Take her back to the cell," he barked to the guards, his voice devoid of the warmth I had tasted in the shadows. As I was dragged away, I caught one last glimpse of him. He was standing alone in the center of the gold-flecked floor, the most powerful man in the room, and the most haunted. The game was getting harder. The masks were starting to slip. The silence of the sub-level cells was shattered not by a siren, but by the bone-chilling thud of a kinetic blast. The glass walls of my chamber didn't just break, they atomized, turning into a cloud of shimmering dust. Before the emergency lights could even flicker from blue to red, the shadows in the hallway materialized into men wearing the jagged crimson insignias of the Iron Vipers, June's most ruthless rivals. "So this is the glitch in the machine," a voice rasped. A man stepped through the smoke, his face scarred and his cybernetic eyes glowing with a predatory amber light. It was Vance, a butcher who saw June's calculated order as a target. He didn't look at me with lust or curiosity. He looked at me like a lever he could use to crack a safe. "June has grown soft," Vance mused, stepping over the unconscious bodies of the syndicate guards. "His biometric feeds have been screaming for days. He thinks he can hide a heartbeat in a city of stone. He forgot that we're all hungry for a crack in his armor." I scrambled back, reaching for a shard of glass, but a heavy boot pinned my hand to the floor. The pain was sharp, but the fear for June was sharper. If they had me, they didn't just have a hostage. They had the evidence of his treason. They had the proof that the king of the underground was infected by the very love he was supposed to eradicate. "Take her," Vance commanded, "and leave the comms open. I want June to hear her scream when he realizes the price of his sentimentality." I was hauled upward, a jagged needle pressing into the side of my neck. The sedative hit my bloodstream like liquid ice. As the world began to tilt and fade into grey, the last thing I saw was the security monitor on the far wall. It showed June, blocks away at the syndicate council meeting, his head suddenly snapping toward the camera, as if he could feel the exact moment the air left my lungs. He wasn't the Mafia king in that moment. He was a man watching his soul get ripped out. I tried to scream his name, to tell him to stay away, to tell him I wasn't worth the empire he would have to burn to find me. But the darkness claimed me, pulling me into a cold, hollow void, where the only thing left was the memory of his hand against my scar. The breach was complete. The secret was out. And as I slipped into unconsciousness, I knew that by the time I woke up, the city would be on fire. The iron-scented air of the Viper's warehouse was heavy, with the taste of copper and wet concrete. I was chained to a rusted pillar, my head swimming from the sedative. But the sound that woke me wasn't a voice. It was the sound of an ending. Outside, the rhythmic thud, thud, thud of a heavy-caliber rifle tore through the night, followed by the screams of men who had been trained to be fearless and were failing miserably. The heavy steel doors didn't open. They were blown off their hinges by a directional charge. Through the smoke and the jagged sparks of dying circuitry, June appeared. He wasn't the impeccably dressed leader from the gala. His jacket was gone, his white shirt was stained with a violent map of red, and his eyes were no longer the cold, calculated tools of a strategist. They were the eyes of a storm. "June, stop!" Vance roared, grabbing me by the hair and pressing a vibrating pulse blade to my throat. "One more step and she's recycled. Look at your HUD, June. The council has already flagged you. You're redlining. You're a dead man." June didn't stop. He didn't even slow down. He walked through the crossfire of Vance's remaining guards like a ghost through a graveyard, firing with a terrifying singular focus. He didn't take cover. He didn't calculate the odds. He was violating every protocol of the syndicate, every rule of survival that had kept him alive in this frozen world. He was showing the world exactly what he felt, and the biometric scanners embedded in the walls were screaming in a high-pitched, continuous wail of deviance detected. "Let her go," June said. "It wasn't a negotiation, it was a decree," Vance sneered, his finger twitching on the blade. "You'd burn it all for a broken asset. You're infected, June. You're pathetic." "I'm alive," June countered. In one fluid motion, he threw his empty weapon at Vance's head and lunged. The collision was brutal. June fought with a feral, unrefined rage that ignored his own safety. He took a knife to the shoulder just to get close enough to snap Vance's wrist, the pulse blade clattering harmlessly away. Within seconds, the room was silent, save for the heavy, ragged breathing of a man who had just destroyed his future. June knelt in the glass, and blood, his hands shaking as he fumbled with the locks on my chains. When the metal finally fell away, I collapsed into him. He didn't pull back. He wrapped his arms around me, burying his face in the crook of my neck, his heart hammering against my ribs, like a trapped bird finally finding a crack in the cage. "I've got you," he choked out, his voice cracking, a sound that was illegal, beautiful, and final. High above, the city's searchlights began to converge on the warehouse. The syndicate's execution squads were coming for their fallen king. He had saved me. But in doing so, he had told the world that he loved me. And in our world, that was the only sin that couldn't be forgiven. The basement of a safe house in the city's industrial fringe smelled of damp earth and dying machinery. Outside, the rain had turned into a torrential downpour, masking the infrared heat signatures of the drones circling above. June sat on a wooden crate, his blood-soaked shirt discarded, while I pressed a medical adhesive to the jagged wound on his shoulder. Every time my fingers brushed his skin, the biometric monitor on his wrist, now cracked and sparking, let out a low, mourning chirp. The door creaked open, and Kyle stepped into the shadows. He wasn't holding a weapon, but his presence was a death sentence. He looked at June, not with the usual cold deference, but with a pity that made my stomach churn. "The council is willing to overlook the glitch in the warehouse," Kyle said, his voice flat, devoid of the static of emotion. They've categorized it as a temporary psychosis caused by neurotoxin exposure. They want their king back, June. You're too valuable to recycle. June looked up, his eyes weary. And the price? The girl is erased, Cal replied, glancing at me as if I were a smudge on a pristine lens. She'll be sent to the outer colonies. Her memories of the last month will be purged. She'll live, but she won't know your name. You'll return to the spire, take the inhibitors, and we'll pretend this heartbeat never happened. It's the only way you both survive the night. The silence that followed was heavier than the concrete above us. Separation meant life, a hollow grey existence, but life nonetheless. Staying together meant being hunted until our lungs gave out. Two anomalies in a world that demanded perfection. I reached out, taking June's hand in mine. His skin was hot, feverish, with the very thing they wanted to cure. June, I whispered, my voice thick. You can have your empire back. You don't have to die for a memory. June stood up, his height dwarfing the small room. He looked at Carl, then down at our joined hands. For years, he had been a master of logic, a king of the cold. But as he looked at me, I saw the exact moment he threw it all away. He didn't just choose me, he chose the pain, the fear, and the short, violent life of a human being over the eternal life of a machine. Tell the council to keep their inhibitors, June said, his voice regaining its steel, but tempered now with a terrifying warmth. I'd rather die with my memories than live as a ghost in a suit. Kyle's expression didn't change, but he took a step back, into the dark. Then you are already dead. The execution squads are 4 minutes out. Run while you still have legs. June turned to me, grabbing his tactical gear. There was no hesitation left in him. There's a dead zone past the city gates, he said, pulling me toward the back exit. It's a long shot, Arya. We probably won't make the border. I don't care, I said, stepping out into the freezing rain beside him. As long as I know who's holding my hand when we fall. The neon glow of Sol faded into a harsh, monochromatic strobe as we reached the perimeter, a towering wall of reinforced steel and laser grids that separated the ordered world from the lawless wasteland of the dead zone. The air here tasted like salt and ozone. Behind us, the hum of 100 pursuit drones rose into a collective shriek, their red spotlights sweeping the wet asphalt like the eyes of an angry god. The gate override is at the central pillar, June shouted over the roar of the wind. He shoved a pulse rifle into my hands, his own movements a blur of desperate efficiency. Arya, when that gate cracks, you run. You don't look back for me. You just run until the sensors go dark. I'm not leaving you, I snapped, pivoting to fire at a hovering scout drone. The machine erupted in a shower of sparks. This isn't a negotiation, he roared. But his voice broke as he pulled me behind a concrete barricade. The syndicate's elite execution squads were already dismounting from their sleek black transporters. They moved in, perfect, terrifying unison, a wall of silent machines coming to reclaim their lost king. The shootout began as a symphony of chaos. Blue plasma bolts hissed through the rain, melting the metal around us. June was a force of nature, standing tall against the very empire he had built. He fought with a reckless grace, taking a hit to the thigh and another to his side, his white shirt now almost entirely crimson. Every time he fired, he was shouting a defiance that the city's microphones would record for eternity. A legacy of noise in a world of silence. I stayed by his side, my fingers raw from the heat of the rifle covering his flank as he worked the bypass codes. June, they're closing in. Almost. There. He slammed his fist against the console, and with a tectonic groan, the massive gates began to part. Beyond them lay nothing but darkness and the smell of wild, uncurbed earth. The council's heavy turrets locked onto our position. A red targeting laser settled on June's chest. In that split second, he didn't look at the gate or the enemy. He looked at me. The icy leader was dead. Only the man remained, bleeding and beautiful. He lunged, not for cover, but to shield me, his body taking the brunt of the kinetic blast that threw us both through the opening gap. As we tumbled into the dirt of the dead zone, the gate hissed shut behind us, severed by the syndicate's own security protocols to prevent the infection from spreading. The silence of the wasteland was sudden and absolute. I crawled toward him through the mud, my breath coming in jagged sobs. June, June. He lay in the dark, his breath a shallow rattle, but his hand found mine in the dirt. We were on the other side. We were broken, hunted and dying. But for the first time in our lives, the air we breathed belonged to us. The transition was visceral. On the other side of the gate, the city's omnipresent hum, the electronic vibration that dictated the rhythm of every heartbeat, simply vanished. The dead zone was a cathedral of natural sound. The erratic drumming of rain on autumn leaves, the low howl of a wind that hadn't been filtered by a ventilation shaft, and the heavy, wet thud of our footsteps on earth that had never known concrete. I pulled June's arm over my shoulder, dragging him toward the shelter of a cluster of ancient, twisted pines. His weight was a heavy reminder of the cost of our exit. We collapsed onto a bed of pine needles, far beyond the reach of the syndicate's infrared eyes and biometric leashes. The silence here wasn't cold. It was thick and fertile, a space waiting to be filled. June leaned back against a tree trunk, his face pale beneath the smears of blood and oil. He reached up, his fingers trembling as he fumbled with the cracked biometric band on his wrist. With a final, defiant tug, he ripped the metal from his skin and tossed it into the shadows. The red warning light flickered once and died. "It's quiet," he whispered, his voice rasping but clear. He looked at his hands as if seeing them for the first time. "I can't hear them anymore. The voices of the council, the data feeds. It's all gone." I knelt between his knees, pressing my hands to his chest to check the wounds. Underneath my palms, his heart was still racing. But it was no longer a crime. It was just a rhythm. A messy, human song that belonged to him and him alone. I looked up at him, my eyes stinging with tears that were no longer a biological malfunction. "You saved us," I said, my voice breaking. June reached out, cupping my face with his hand. His touch was warm, stained with the reality of our struggle, but his gaze was the steadiest thing I had ever known. In the city, we had communicated in codes, in shadows, and in whispers masked by white noise. We had survived on the crumbs of what we felt. But here, under the canopy of a lawless sky, the truth didn't need a mask. "Arya," he murmured, his thumb brushing over my lips. "I love you." The words hung in the air, shimmering and solid. They didn't trigger an alarm. They didn't bring the execution squads. The world didn't end, it began. I leaned forward, pressing my forehead against his, closing the distance that the world had tried so hard to maintain. "I love you," I replied, the words a vow and a victory. We were two ghosts who had learned how to breathe again. We were a king without a throne and a thief, with nothing left to steal. But as the sun began to bleed through the grey clouds on the horizon, I knew we were finally whole. I was his weakness, and he was mine. And in a world that had tried to outlaw the heart, that weakness was the only thing that made us powerful.